So I'm not really a big fan of the idea that you should have like a favorite Bible verse, but if I had to pick one, it would probably be from that whole sequence in chapter 17 of the Gospel of John, in which Jesus is praying for the unity of his church. This was his dying prayer. He knows he's about to leave his disciples, and he prays to the Father that they would be one as he and the Father are one. He also anticipates that their unity would reflect on him and be a kind of evidence that he truly is the Son of God, which means that disunity in the church would actually be a scandal to the world as well. Which is why the disunity of Christians and the thousands of denominations that currently exist and are only growing in number has been something like a gift-wrapped piece of ammunition for anyone who wants to take a swipe at the validity of Christianity. And that's what we see among a lot of polemicists, but especially among Muslims and atheists who like to say, look at how dysfunctional you Christians are. Your history is one of constant fighting with one another over the most trivial of differences, even to the point of some of the bloodiest wars in European history. Surely thousands upon thousands of denominations who refuse to worship together is a sign that Christianity is not true. But as counterintuitive as it might seem, I'd argue that this is exactly what you would expect to see, not just of the true church, but any claim of truth or any repository of truth, in part because anything good is always going to have to suffer counterfeits. But it actually goes even much deeper than that. Think about something like an algebra exam question where you have to show your work at every step and there are multiple marks that you can earn for getting the whole thing right. Now, what would the inventory of answers for a question like that be if you could put it into something like a pie chart? There would be a big portion of the right answer, hopefully the majority of questions if those students have done well. Then there would be a few very, very wrong questions that disagree with the right answer and disagree with each other. These would just be like wild misses. But then there would be a lot of just about right answers, and there would be a few variations of them as well. In total, you'd have a lot of different kinds of attempts to get the right answer, and the fact that there are so many nearly right answers isn't evidence that there isn't a right answer, but rather evidence that there is a right answer, which is found by a majority of the responses, or at least a considerable number of them. And don't misunderstand what I'm saying by that. I'm not saying that most people arrive at the truth in life. Truth is definitely not a democracy, but I am saying that there will be a considerable number of people who get important answers right as long as it is possible to get them right, which are hard to ignore and which all the right answers kind of seem to orbit around. Another analogy would be like a target practice at a shooting range. There's one bullseye and everyone's aiming for it, right? And quite a few people will actually hit the middle. For those that don't, you'll get a few really off the mark shots and again, wild misses. But then you'll get a large number of like near misses. They came close, but didn't hit the middle, which is a kind of proof that there is a middle. The large number of misses isn't an indication that the middle is lacking in what it should be, but that we aren't perfect when we try to connect with it. A last obvious analogy would be in something like gravity. So celestial objects like planets, stars, moons, they all produce gravitational effects on other objects like asteroids. And sometimes these asteroids are pulled right into collision with these bodies, but some are just pulled by them so that they have close misses, perhaps lots of close misses. And this is often how objects in space are discovered, not through direct observation, but by the gravitational effects that they have on other directly observed objects. The fact that objects are being pulled towards them tells observers that there's something there causing that gravitational effect. So the fact that there are lots of near collisions or near misses shows that there is some kind of center of gravity pulling things towards it. The same is true of Christianity. So we have a very large center mass of people in the Catholic Church. Then you have some pretty large and very close alternatives. Then you have a lot of other near misses. And then you have a few wild misses. And if you were able to visualize that, it might look exactly like that pie chart we were talking about with the algebra question or a target practice sheet. It's exactly what you should and would see of anything like the fullness of truth. There'd be lots of earnest attempts at discovering it, lots of counterfeits, and a few who actually find it. But if nobody found it, it would just be a chaotic mess. The fact that it is there is what creates that center of gravity that all the other claimants orbit around. All those near misses only exist because there actually is a center. If there was no center, there would also be no near misses. A quick thank you to one of my sponsors, Charity Mobile. So if you're a US resident, you should switch to a phone company who aligns with your values rather than against them. For nearly 30 years, Charity Mobile has been supporting the cause of life and the traditional family, and they send 5% of your monthly plan price to the pro-life, pro-family charity of your choice. They call this Everyday Living Effortless Giving. All of their plans start under $50, including the unlimited plan. And they also have a talk and text only plan if you don't want cellular data for yourself or your kids. They have phones to meet every need with great nationwide coverage and no contracts. Now you can buy the way you believe with Charity Mobile. US residents can use promo code Brian to get a free phone with free activation and free shipping. Visit CharityMobile.com to learn more. Again, that's CharityMobile.com, promo code Brian. It's also really important to remember that for over 1,000 years, the church was unified as one thing. It suffered a schism in the 11th century between East and West, which was largely a consequence of the original division of the Roman Empire between East and West, and like the enduring secular interference in the affairs of the church. Then it soldiered on for another 500 years in the West before another division in Protestantism. And when you see the thousands of denominations of today, you might think those are all thousands of breakaways with the source. But that's not the case. They are thousands of breakaways with other breakaways or other near misses. Because after the Protestant reformers initially broke with the Catholic Church, within a generation, they started breaking away with each other. And then those breakaways broke with each other, and the growth of the separations just became exponential at that point, which makes sense because if you're wrong, you have a lot more to disagree about. The early schismatics tried to form a new unity, but they discovered they didn't have just as much to complain about with the new church as before. They had even more to complain about. So they immediately followed that same solution that they resolved on before, which was tear yourselves apart and then try to create something whole out of it, which is obviously counterintuitive. And that pattern has just continued on down the line. History has proven, it's demonstrated to us that Protestantism is by its nature divisive because they can't hold the center. And if Catholicism, the true center, ceased to exist, the one thing that Protestants have in common would be gone. And ironically, their center of gravity would be gone with it, and they would just completely drift apart. There would be nothing left within a few generations. But because there continues to be a true center of gravity, even though they are so divisive by nature, all those near misses have something pulling them in the right direction, even with one another, and they don't even realize it. When I was a fledgling Christian, that passage in John 17 was instrumental in convincing me of two things. One, that Jesus was very intentional about establishing a visibly unified body of believers. And two, that such unity would be a reflection of his presence among his believers. If I were to find a church to belong to, it would be one that was a source of visible unity rather than disunity. And from what I could tell in every Protestant community I visited, it was like everyone had divorce papers ready to go in their back pockets. And at any moment, they would just quit that church or go and form their own. There was this like very fragile truce in these communities. There was so little binding them together, and both their history and their theology gave them permission to do this. After all, the church to them was just a mystical body, not an actual organized one. So they could break away and tell themselves they were still part of that original mystical body. And then I encountered other passages in the Bible, like Matthew 18:17, where Jesus instructs believers who are having disputes and conflicts with one another to try to work it out, but if they can't, bring their complaints to the church as a final court of authority. But this means, if that's legitimate, and if we're going to follow Jesus in his instructions, that the church has to be clearly and visibly identifiable. It isn't some invisible fabric that bonds believers together, but an actual authoritative and organized body. And then in Acts 15, we see this very visible church exercise its authority to make a binding decision on all the faithful in what is often considered the first church council. They call it the Council of Jerusalem. This convinced me that if I wanted to be a follower of Jesus, I had to care about unity. I had to bind myself to a community that was visibly unified and wasn't going to betray that unity at the drop of a hat. I knew that it would be something like a center of gravity, especially for all those other denominations, and that it would be also a considerable size in order to be that center of gravity, spread throughout the whole world. After all, Jesus told them to baptize people of all nations. And again, based on what scripture was telling me, I knew it would have to have an authority to bind my adherents to the faith. And when I surveyed the landscape and looked around, that didn't seem to exist anywhere outside of the Catholic Church. Orthodox churches had some of those traits and a lot to admire, but they themselves were not a unifying force by any measure. They were all divided by national boundaries and influenced by temporal interests of those national boundaries. We see that played out for us right now between Ukraine and Russia, as those two branches of Orthodoxy refuse to have anything to do with each other, and not for theological reasons. So if you want to follow Jesus, you have to care about unity as much as he did. You have to look for that center of gravity, which obviously exists, because if it didn't, there wouldn't be so many pieces orbiting around it. You have to look for a visible church that has authority to judge the affairs of the faithful and make binding decisions for us to follow the practice of the faith. And it's really hard to claim that your local Presbyterian church, which is a breakaway from another Presbyterian church, which is a breakaway from the Reformed movement, which is a breakaway from Luther's movement, is that same church, the one that lasted for 1,000 years in visible unity. It's really hard to claim that your Baptist or your Methodist or your Anglican church is that church. Anglicans will say, that we're part of the original Catholic Church in England, but it's like, could you just remind me how the Catholic Church ever arrived in England in the first place? Oh, right. It was St. Augustine who came in the 6th century from Rome, sent by Pope Gregory. It didn't just sprout up out of the ground. It was in union with the Catholic Church all the way up until Henry lost his marbles, so for like 1,000 years. And lastly, if the Catholic Church is really the center of gravity I'm claiming it is, you might expect to see some of those breakaways or satellites get absorbed back into it from time to time. And in fact, that is what we've seen. We've seen large portions of Anglicans, for example, come back through the Ordinariate. We've seen it in the Union of Brest, in which a large portion of Eastern Orthodox Christians came back into union with Rome. The Melkite Greek Catholic Union in the 18th century saw many Eastern Orthodox communities in places like Syria and Lebanon enter back into communion with Rome, forming the Melkite Greek Catholic Church. And between the 16th and 19th centuries, there were ongoing absorptions of segments of the Church of the East, which was like the traditionally Nestorian church, which eventually became the Chaldean Catholic Church. Simultaneously, it's important to note, and is sad to admit this, but that no such absorptions have taken place in other denominations. There are no major groups grafting themselves onto the Church of England or like the Lutherans or anything like that. Among those who stay separated from Rome, they only have a history of further divisions. Okay, thanks for watching. These videos and this channel are only possible because of viewer support. So if you can spare some help, please consider making a contribution through my website at brianholdsworth.ca, or join my locals community at brianholdsworth.locals.com, where you can interact with myself and other like-minded individuals. We actually just started a monthly Zoom meetup where we're studying some articles of St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa. So if that's interesting to you, then come join us there. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.